Okay, now I'm recording it. So other people who aren't here who might want to have access to it can have access to it from 15 minutes or so into the class. So, okay, so if I could then have us all suggest certain themes for the second Sunday in Lent. I gave you a link to an article on Nicodemus. Nicodemus comes up in the John 3 gospel passage, and I don't know if you find it interesting to read articles by scholars on passages in the lectionary, but I just thought if you did find it interesting, then here's a PDF file to a very recent article on Nicodemus from a certain perspective that you might find it useful to reflect on. And by the way, through this Moodle site, you have access to ATLA. ATLA is the American Theological Library Association database. And through that, the Diocese of Central Pennsylvania has given you access to that database so that you can do any research, and that database will kick up articles on topics that you enter search terms for. So you have access to a great library of collections through the Diocese of Central Pennsylvania Moodle website. So I'm hoping that you will not just rely on me for suggestions, but you will take yourself into that opportunity and find other materials. It may be that your local library in Connecticut or Washington State is a very good local library. Brooklyn Public Library here is good, but it takes a while to get through all the databases that they have, and they don't always have theological databases. So please feel free to use that. Okay, so I mentioned Nicodemus. Nicodemus obviously is a theme for the gospel reading. And since I'm on the notion of characters, Abraham. Abraham comes up in the Genesis reading and in the Romans reading as well, from different perspectives. So one would be the call of Abraham in Genesis 12. I gave you a link to an article on Abraham. If any of the links aren't working, please let me know. And Paul's take on the function of Abraham in Romans 4. So those are things. Those are two approaches to the lectionary that that I note when looking at these materials. So do you have other observations that might contribute to a discussion about the lectionary?
I've been especially interested in Nicodemus' conversation with Jesus about born again. And if one says I'm born again in an Episcopal church, that's almost a guarantee that people will not talk to you during coffee hour. And Nicodemus is wrestling with concrete thinking, and Jesus is obviously not thinking concrete.
Right. Thank you. So, Amy, in that regard, the translation that is in this particular lectionary text is, as opposed to being born again, being born from above, which, as you know from your annotated Bibles, is a possible translation of the Greek anothen. It's a little adverb, so it can be translated this way. So does that make it, Amy, any more palatable for Episcopal ears?
Well, yes, politically, but
right.
Again,
born
from above.
Yeah. So,
yeah, this is Rebecca. That's what I was going to say. I think this whole notion of if you live in places where there's more fundamentalist Christianity, that being born again, have you been born again? Yeah. That's the question that people get asked so often. And I think if you're Episcopalian in that context, then it's hard. Sometimes you just don't know what to say, I guess. Yeah.
I'm not so much interested in the born again part or born above. I'm very interested in how one might examine what it is to be born, period.
Mm-hmm.
What is the nature of born?
Mm-hmm.
I find that very interesting in that whole discussion of being born again, that of course the evangelical perspective and the fundamentalist perspective, but it offers precisely because of that an entree into a deeper understanding of being born again and baptism.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing in this gospel that I think is interesting is towards the end, very truly, I tell you, we speak of what we know and testify to what we have seen, yet you do not receive our testimony. If I have told you about earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you about heavenly things? So in some of the justice work I've done, it's just hard to imagine that people don't know what is going on for other people. You know, there's so much, especially with the internet, and there's so much information out there. And yet I've done a lot of work around race and racism, and people, especially white people, will say they don't know it exists, or they need to hear from people of color. And it's like, there's tons of stuff out there. Like, there is no reason that you need somebody else. And so I've always related to this piece, because it's like you see it all around you, and yet you do not believe. And so what are the things then that God can't come and tell us, or Jesus wasn't able to come and tell us about, because we couldn't even believe what was before our eyes? And and then you look at the faith of Abraham, who just said, sure, God, I'll pick up and move, you know, like without even seeing. I mean, so those are some of the things that come up for me.
I wrestle with God so loved the world that he gave his only son, and the questions of, you know, how could a loving God give his son, knowing what happened?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a question I always get on that passage. And then I always really am interested in pointing out the next verse, which people don't know so well. He came not to condemn the world. And I think that's a verse people really need to hear, in addition to the other one.
That's very helpful, Linda. Very helpful. Okay, so shall we start with these ideas, because these are fantastic ideas. So just working through them a little bit. So Stephen was talking about the whole notion of the nature of birth and what it might mean. Well, he said the nature of born, which I've translated into birth, the nature of birth in John's gospel, and what born above or born from again might connote. There's no birth narrative in John's gospel. So I'm not saying that there's no birth. There is, of course, this language about birth, but it is different when you have a birth narrative, right? And you don't have one in John. So this means that birth is not as simple as it might seem to people who who come to this language as if it connotes literal things. And of course, you know, this is how John's gospel works, that as Amy was pointing out, there's one level of understanding, and that seems to be the one in this passage that Nicodemus possesses. And then there is another level of understanding, and that is what Jesus seems to be talking about, which is what Steve is is wanting to get at. But the point about this passage in and its understandings of birth is that there isn't a meeting point. There's no meeting point between these two entities. Now, there is a way to, and this is what the article points out, there is a way to work at a resolution between Nicodemus and Jesus. If you go on and look at Nicodemus' role in John's gospel as a whole. So this isn't the only place where Nicodemus appears. So you could go on and say, maybe there's a resolution to Nicodemus that takes place somewhere between the lines of the text. And then we see the results of it when Nicodemus appears later towards the end of Jesus' life. That's one way to look at it. The other way is to simply sit with the contradictions between Nicodemus's observations and Jesus' statements. Because it's that sharp contrast, that sharp difference that seems to be a focus of the whole passage. So let's just say, if in John there is no birth narrative, Jesus comes from above. You know, he's not born of Mary, he comes from above. He is, as Wayne Meeks said, Amy will know Wayne Meeks from Yale Divinity School, Wayne Meeks called Jesus in John's Gospel the Son of Man, the man from above, the person from above. In other words, the rest of us are from below. Jesus is from above. Okay, and so everything that Jesus says from above is speaking from a different world. This is what Rebecca is talking about. I'm speaking about heavenly things, says Jesus, and you are speaking about earthly things. In other words, the origins of Nicodemus and Jesus are completely opposed to each other. So, however, there's another entity that functions in this passage, and that is the narrator. The person who is narrating John 3, the narrator of John, is the other entity. So this would be called reader response criticism. So as I read John 3, I'm the reader, right? I read John 3, I see that there's a narrator who's telling me the characters of John 3, Nicodemus and Jesus, and the narrator understands. Do you see? So there is a bridge to understanding because the narrator has created this passage. So that would be another way to look at that. That the people who understand what's going on in John are the narrator and Jesus. Nicodemus does not at this point, and maybe Nicodemus is not hopeless, but rather offers a way to sit with an incomprehension, that will not be forever. Think of doubting Thomas in John 20-21. There are these characters in John's Gospel who seem to be completely antithetical to Jesus, but who have an important role in the narrative. And maybe it's to accommodate certain attitudes that Jesus is trying to deal with on the part of disciples.
I think Nicodemus does get it later.
Right.
Because in chapter 7, he's defending Jesus.
Right.
And then at the end, he's one of the operatives who helps to bury Jesus.
Exactly.
Something grows in Nicodemus over the gospel.
Exactly. But we don't see it.
No, not yet.
We don't see it, which is kind of interesting for Episcopalians, Amy, who sometimes think of their spiritual lives as hidden with God in Christ. I'm here using Pauline language. You know, that the spiritual growth that is part of formation that we don't see a lot of because we experience it collectively and we don't talk about it. Yeah, I'm just reacting to, your point about Episcopal reactions to language about being born again. So I was thinking about, the spiritual growth of Nicodemus is something that is hidden. And I think Episcopalians can appreciate that. Now, the question of John 3:16 is a great question. Linda, you were asking how is it that God expresses love, and that love is the giving of the Son the giving of the Son, which of course we know is the giving that results in death. So how is it possible? Is that what you're asking? How is it possible to understand that? Is that right, Linda? I want to be sure I've understood that properly. I'm reading a book about how to ask the right questions, and it's a very long book, and I haven't gotten to the end of it. So I want to flag whether I've gotten the right question here. Is it a diagnostic question? Is it an information? Anyway, so okay. So what do you all think? I mean, I have some ideas about this. They're not very Johannine ideas about this. And they start with something like an observation that love is always giving. And I'm not a theologian, so I don't move in this world comfortably, the language of theological reflection. But if love is giving, it is free giving. It is free giving, which means that you don't control the outcome of it. In other words, it is uncontrolled. In other words, it is non-coercive. I mean, I think if we can say anything about God, it is that God does not coerce people to behave. God, just to use modern language here, God believes in free will. It seems silly to say God believes in anything, but free will is part of the nature of God. And so I suppose you'd have to say then that that there is a possibility that God's love, although it is for the glory of the world, and it's the world that God has as the object of God's love, nevertheless, things can happen that God cannot control, and that would be the behavior of other people that results in the death of Jesus. I'm not very good at theology, but those are some thoughts about a very profound verse, I must say, as a footnote, and then I'll shut up, I find, and here I'm thinking about Rebecca's points about racism, which I found extremely helpful. I've always found Rebecca's points about racism really helpful and provocative. There is an extraordinary universality about "for God so loved the world." It's not "for God so loved the people that listened," or "God so loved the Jews," or the Ethiopians. It's "God so loved the world." Now, the reason that is so interesting in John's Gospel is that Jesus will say later in the discourses of John's Gospel to the Jews, "Your father is the devil. You are children of the devil." So there is a kind of anti-Judaism in John's Gospel. We don't have to get into it this Sunday, thank God. It's a hornet's nest, but there is a difficulty of exclusion in John's Gospel with the way that the Jews, and it's always in Greek hoi judaioi, the Jews, are treated. They're not meant to be all Jews for all time and all place. There's special groups of those who are opposed to Jesus. We get this. But in John 3:16, we haven't met them yet. God loves the world, the whole cosmos. So I just wanted to just flag that in that beautiful, beautiful passage.
I know that we're in John for a short time, but John I find to be a very difficult book under any circumstance. And one reason that it's difficult is that the narrator seldom has Jesus answering a question that somebody asks. He goes off on a tangent in some other direction, leaving the questioner wondering what the heck he's talking about. And when the questioner asks him, he deviates again and goes in another direction. And it's I find it off-putting in a way. It's quite frankly, I don't really like John's gospel very much. So there you go.
that is very candid and refreshing, Steve. I can completely sympathize, and the way I think about it is this. When you have a dialogue, we are all having a dialogue together, and what we are trying to do is the kind of thing that Plato's dialogue is demonstrating, namely we're trying to deepen our insight by listening to each other. And by focusing on the text, we're trying to get a further insight into the passage. So when we finish an hour later, we feel as if we have learned something that we didn't know before. But that's not what happens with the dialogue in John's Gospel. In fact, there isn't a deeper understanding at all. I mean, we just said, Amy and I agreed that, and Linda too, I believe that Nicodemus isn't gaining from the dialogue. He's gone off and his insight comes beyond the gospel. So that, in fact, Steve, the dialogues are confusing. They're confusing. They look like they should be working, but they do not work at all. And in fact, in the end, Jesus gives up dialogue in John's gospel. And then what you get is where you learn more, if you're going to learn things from John, and that is the long discourses. I am the bread of life. The farewell discourse of John 17, what's going to happen after I'm gone, is that this is my legacy to you, and so on. In other words, there's no dialogue going on there at all. So you might as well not have had the dialogue. I will say that the woman at the well in John 4 seems to me the exception that proves the rule. I see you nodding, Steve. Yeah. So it's possible that there could be dialogues in which there might be a shared and deeper insight, but Nicodemus is not one of them. Not one of them. Not one of them.
So your article, the article that you gave us, points out that Nicodemus could be perceived as a dissembler, that he's feigning ignorance.
Yeah.
I think he just really doesn't get it.
Yes, and you don't have to buy the argument of everything that I posed for you at all. But so you could say, yes, Nicodemus just doesn't get it. He seems to want to try because he doesn't just give up. He keeps going. So he's got some kind of ego invested in trying to get it too. But yeah. So I don't know. Putting this in the second Sunday in Lent, along with the Great Litany, might do in more of your parishioners than you really want to do. Maybe you've had the Great Litany already. So, I work these days at Trinity Wall Street, and I must say that the Great Litany, as we had in the first Sunday of Lent, is really an endurance test. So Stephen has permitted me to say things that are the difficulties of the passage and the Lenten experience, and I haven't found a way to really embrace the Great Litany liturgically. So that's just me. That's just me. So.
Deidre, I had just when you said that we were talking about love is always giving, freely giving, an uncontrolled outcome, it's not coerced.
Yeah.
So you said at one point things happen that God cannot control. So that leads to the death of Jesus.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit different understanding, because I've always been troubled, like Linda, with this child sacrifice, since we know child sacrifice was part of the culture at one point there. And I thought, oh my gosh, how can we say it's not okay to sacrifice your child when we have this whole narrative around Jesus being God's son? So instead, I like what you said so much, because it's not about child sacrifice to appease the God or whatever, or to even to reconcile the relationship through child sacrifice,
Yeah.
it is looking at your child as something so precious that is just unbounded, unconditional love that you send into the world. And it could be dangerous. It can lead to death, and you do it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that?
Absolutely. I mean, so two things. One is that John's whole understanding of the meaning of Jesus' death is exaltation. And I, says Jesus in John's gospel, when I'm lifted up, will draw all people to me. And lifted up means on the cross. So the cross is exaltation in John's gospel. So this is completely different than my God, why have you forsaken me in Mark and Matthew's gospel, right? Where the cross is abandonment and shame and derision. In John, it is the abandonment and shame and derision, but John wants to say other things about it. It's about the exaltation. So it's kind of making of death something extraordinary, that there is meaning in death that has to do with the transformation of death. It's completely different than Paul. I mean, for Paul, the crucifixion is foolishness. But it's actually the wisdom of God. So it's moving along those lines. Paul and John are not connected at all. But I mean, you can see how Paul is doing something else with crucifixion too, because he knows it's shame and humiliation, and so he wants to do something else with it as well. And so it becomes the wisdom of God. Well, how can it be wise? How can it be wise for somebody to be crucified like a criminal and so on? So whether the exaltation in John or the wisdom of God, every New Testament writer is wrestling with how to make sense of the meaning of the crucifixion. And John shifts it completely into another sphere, exaltation. And as you know from John 4, the woman at the well, once you drink the water from the well, the understanding and insight that Jesus offers, you will never be thirsty again. So you've moved from death to life right there. So there's we're not driving towards Jesus' death. We're actually driving towards encounters with Jesus that transform the meaning of life too. So that's how I see it. I mean, the people who are responsible for Jesus' death are quite clearly the Romans who do it. We know that. And not all Romans, but specific Romans. And the Jewish leaders. I say Jewish leaders very specifically because they're the ones who are responsible for the death of Jesus in all of the Gospels and in Paul. Not all Jews in Jerusalem, and certainly not all Jews, in the first century and so on. So it's important just to be absolutely clear about that, because in the liturgical materials at Easter, at Lent, in the Triduum of Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and the Great Vigil, you will have this issue raised for you, who actually is responsible for Jesus' death. So it's good to get really clear that it is the Romans who do it, but they wouldn't have done it without the instigation of Jewish leaders. That doesn't mean that all Jews are responsible, but anyway. So,
Deidre,
yeah.
Could we say along these lines, in light of what we're saying about, what Rebecca is saying about racism, also as a Jewish leader, Nicodemus is a Pharisee, and we could say even John himself, and we've talked about, I remember the last weekend in Danville, talking about Jesus moving from a sense of provinciality, particularly with the Syrophoenician woman, growing in his understanding, if you could say that about Jesus himself. But John, perhaps, but definitely Nicodemus, that he does feign ignorance. He has his sense of, he's blown away in this, that he realizes he really is ignorant, that it's beyond his capacity to understand, and it will eventually transform him. I think that conversation, even though he doesn't get it, is transformative in a very profound way in him that we see later borne out. That's almost nonverbal, but it's very impactful, the encounter with Jesus that he's having.
Yep. I hear that. And after all, he is identified by Jesus as a teacher in Israel. Are you a teacher in Israel and you don't know these things? So I guess you could say that something like the redemption of Nicodemus holds out the possibility of some Jews getting it, some Jews understanding. They have to work at it. It's not simple. It's not simple, but yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Do you see we've concentrated on the gospel, which is great. Abraham, what about Abraham? Might Abraham feature at all? I think it was Steve was pointing out, the call of Abraham in Genesis 12. Or maybe it was Linda, that God speaks to Abraham and he simply goes. That's phenomenal. And the blessings that come with the response that Abraham gives, that in Genesis 12, that lead on to the covenant traditions, are extraordinary. In Romans 4, when Paul talks about Abraham, he sees for the Romans, these people to whom he's writing, whom he has never met, he is trying to explain facets of his gospel, the gospel of Jesus crucified, to people he's never met in Rome, and he explains that Abraham is the ancestor according to the flesh, and that Abraham is somebody who is made right with God, justified by works, because of what he did. In other words, because of his immediate obedience to God. This was something that he did. He uprooted himself. He took his whole family. He took them and he set off who knows where. And he kept the law. Do you remember Abraham was circumcised late in life and so on? So that becomes a symbol of his obedience to God. So Abraham then functions as the righteousness of faith, obedience to the law. I suppose obedience as an example of Abraham might be a theme of these lectionary readings. I don't know how well people sit these days with obedience. We tend to speak about autonomy and free will and the American dream. Obedience isn't part of that language and so on. But I mean, I think in Lent you can get away with some things that you might not be able to get away with at other times of the year. So anyway. And if you think of obedience, then, and I'll stop in a moment, look at the collect. O God, whose glory it is always to have mercy. You see, there's that compassion. There's that non-coercive compassion. And if you're being obedient and you are falling short, as we all do when we try to keep commandments and so on, nevertheless, God's mercy is what will meet us as we try in this Lenten season. So God will not turn away from those who approach with a contrite heart. This is a beautiful collect. Then the only thing we've not said anything about is Psalm 121. I suppose in the lectionary readings, this would be the place for the individual. Where am I in all of this? I lift up my eyes to the hills. From whence is my help to come? My help comes from the Lord. It's a beautiful, beautiful psalm. So, in the pursuit of keeping the law, in the pursuit of trying to understand a mysterious Jesus who doesn't make a great deal of sense, God's mercy in the collect, God's presence in the promised help of Psalm 21, God, the maker of heaven and earth, nevertheless cares about individuals like the psalmist here. It's a beautiful psalm.
Deidre, when you were talking before about Abraham's obedience, in some ways that reminded me of what you said about Nicodemus and Jesus, where Jesus came into the world, God sent Jesus into the world, not knowing the outcome, not being able to control the outcome per se. And that's what Abraham didn't know. He had these promises, but he had to step out on faith, not knowing the outcome. And I think that truly is one of the hardest tests of faith, or, hardest things to do, is to say, especially in our society where we're like, well, where are you going to be 5 years from now? And it's like, I don't know. I just know I'm trying to be true to where God is guiding me right now. And I don't know where I'm going to be 5 years from now. But we have this really planned, you need to set goals, you need to do all this stuff. And we see these people who maybe they envisioned an outcome, I don't know, but do just amazing things. Like Abraham didn't say, well, I need to save money, I need to wait until the kids are a certain age, I can't uproot them. It's like, okay, God, you told me I'm going. I'll just uproot, leave everything, and go to this place where maybe I don't even speak the language.
Yep.
Yep. And it's that. Then that's how Jesus comes into the world, just gives all of himself.
Yeah.
Yep. And willing to accept whatever the outcome is.
Yeah, you're quite right, Rebecca. This is an extraordinary passage. And without it, as you said, nothing would happen. It's kind of like Mary's agreement, to Gabriel. Without it, nothing happens. And here is Abraham. There are great stories about Abraham. They're not in the Bible, but about Abraham smashing the idols. Remember, Abraham comes from Ur of the Chaldees, and of course they're all pagan there. And so, of course, what Abraham is going to discover is a completely new faith. He doesn't know this yet, right? But we, the readers, know this. So what Abraham in the legends does before he leaves Rebecca, I mean, he packs up everything he can, but he smashes the idols. In other words, he's burning bridges. In this story, he really is. He can't go back, which is, of course, what the Israelites want to do when they're in the Sinai desert. Well, look, we want to go back. We want beer and leeks, and we brought us into the wilderness. And what are you doing? But Abraham is burning bridges in the legends and stories, so he becomes just an extraordinary figure, a remarkable figure. And of course, there's Sarah. There, she's with him as well, and I mean. It's not just he by himself with a backpack. It's the family group. So yeah, she goes along as well. Yeah.
And that kind of relates to Nicodemus, because even though we don't see it, we know that in some ways he stepped out on faith.
Yeah.
He had to wrestle with breaking out of the mold that he had been in for so long, but somehow he wrestles with it, or somehow there's a process. So eventually he does follow too.
Exactly. So that would suggest patience with people who are wrestling. Like Thomas and John, or Nicodemus and John, or the woman at the well in John. That if we even if it seems that we're not actually dialoguing, there is something that's happening off stage somewhere that is part of God's plan for that individual and that group, that family, and so on. So.
Yeah, I always liked Nicodemus came by night.
Yes.
Yeah, that's one of those little details that's so important.
Absolutely.
He really is sneaking around, but there's something in there.
Yeah.
That he's hungry. He's
Exactly. Excellent. Okay. Well, I think this is it, people. You've got sermons to preach and things to do. So, and it's 6 o'clock by my watch here. So thank you very much. I've really
Thank
enjoyed
you. This has been great.
it's excellent, and it is Monday. I feel good. I feel good about that. I think you have a few more days. It's not Friday, so thank you, and I'll see you this time next week.
Got it.
I'll send you a link to the recording as well. Thank you. Goodbye.